If you're looking for a feel-good show to talk about the virtues of the labor movement, you are tuned into the wrong show. This is the Pro-Labor Conservatives podcast. My name is David Graves. We're not interested in making you feel good. We're interested in the facts. In 1969, the American labor movement controlled 31% of the American workforce. This means that 31% of the American workforce was organized. Today, 10.3% of the American workforce is organized, which means we are doing something terribly wrong. We are failing in every possible way you can fail, and that needs to change. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and over again and expecting a different result, which is what we have been doing as a movement for 30 plus years. This is the Pro-Labor Conservatives podcast. I'm your host, David Graves. Thank you for joining us. Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us. This is the Pro-Labor Conservative podcast. I am your host, David Graves. I would, first off, like to thank everyone who has been listening to the podcast. I haven't done a new episode for a year and a half, and yet somehow people still keep listening to it. And that's, to say it's humbling is an understatement. So I appreciate that. I really do. Today's episode, I wanted to continue the whole right to work thing. It's become a big part of my life, my professional life. Before I can even go into that, I want to touch base on what is happening in the labor market today. Because I think it's important that people kind of understand what's occurring right now. We have this whole thing with Gen Z and the millennials, and I think Gen Y is in there somewhere. There's this quiet quitting concept, right? That's the idea where you're working at the bare minimum, the absolute minimum that the contract requires. These are people who are in fairly good jobs, who are using a tactic that has traditionally been used to show employers that we're worth more. And it really is a tactic that's not meant to be turned into a hashtag. It's a tactic that's meant to be utilized by unions. It's working the contract. That's what it used to be referred to. And this whole quiet quitting thing, it really gives the people who are anti-labor, it gives them a lot of ammunition against us. These are people who don't understand that there are consequences to their ridiculous actions on TikTok. It's sad because whenever I see someone who's doing something that's detrimental to the labor movement, I think about the thousands of Americans who died. There were dads and moms, and there were children who died on the picket line, being burned to death by Molotov cocktails, shot. Atrocious things happened during the labor wars of the early 1900s, and we're sitting here and we're making a mockery of them on TikTok. And it's a shame. This has caused a tremendous amount of, I call it false union hope. And what I mean by false union hope is that we have Starbucks is organizing. So we have a Starbucks organizing. And man, isn't that amazing that 20 people joined a union? Well, they didn't really join a union. That union has to go through the whole process of being recognized by the NLRB. There's a 2-year process involved here. Okay, and at the end of that, the employer can say, you know what, I'm not interested in the contract. Done. And that's it. There is no union. They have to do it again. They have to hold a vote. They have to do a whole thing over again. You know, deciding that you want representation is not the be-all, end-all to unionization. I think it should be, but it's not. You can thank FDR for putting that circuit breaker clause into the original NLRA, which prevents unions from being able to do that. That's a whole other conversation. But really, at the end of the day, we have this false union hope, and we have a lot of union workers who are looking at this going, man, isn't this amazing? Look at that. We're sticking it to the man. And you know what? I guess, kind of. But here's the problem with that. That false union hope gives you this false sense of security that you are invincible. So I want to break that with some real numbers. And these are the newest numbers I've seen. They might have changed. They might have gotten worse. I don't believe they've gotten better, but they could have gotten worse. But this is what it is. Roughly 68% of registered Democrats support right to work. legislation, 68%. 72% of Republicans support right to work legislation. These are registered voters. And 76% of independents, which make up 40% of the U.S. electorate, support right to work legislation. So to believe that right to work, that a federal right to work law isn't coming is insanity. And you know what? You can't put that past the labor movement because we've been doing the same thing over and over and over again, and we've been getting the crap kicked out of us over and over and over again, and we're expecting a different result. We're expecting to win. So, maybe insanity is not that far off from reality here. But the fact is that unions are losing the war. Hard to hear it, hard to admit it, but we're losing. In fact, mathematically, we've lost. Private sector unions make up 4.5 to 4.8% of the entire U.S. labor market. Think about that for 1 second. Right to work at a federal level would literally affect directly, as in about 4.5 to 4.8% of the labor force. In no other world would you care about that unbelievably small number. And you can't look at it like the entire labor movement because you have to remember that we have two different representation systems. We have two union structures in this country. We have public sector labor unions, which right to work doesn't affect at all. And we have private sector labor unions, which right to work is basically destroying. And then we have politicians who are on the wrong side of the fight because they think they're fighting the other side. Now, Republican politicians don't like public sector labor unions because public sector labor unions, they're doing their best to get Democrats elected because they know that Democrats are going to basically negotiate with them and give them favorable contracts. That's how public sector unions work. Republicans seem to think that right to work hurts them, that right to work helps throttle these public sector labor unions, which are growing. And that's not true. In fact, that's the opposite. Right to work hinders private sector labor unions, but it doesn't even really affect public sector labor unions. Public sector labor unions are growing. They grow as the bureaucracy grows. As the state governments and the U.S. government gets bigger, public sector unions inevitably grow. It is not the case for private sector labor unions. So they're attacking the wrong union, the wrong system, the wrong representation structure. But they don't understand that because they don't understand what right to work really is. On the other side of the coin here, we have the union structure that are so lost that they don't understand what's up and what's down. There's an analogy I heard that I think is just perfect for the union system. I was talking to a friend of mine who's a lobbyist in Washington, a pro-labor conservative lobbyist. Go figure, they do exist. He said, unions are like dirt. They're lower than dirt. You got the clouds, right? And up in these clouds, you have all the things in the world that you want. World peace, universal health care, income equality, all of these things. Well, those are up in the clouds. Who touches the clouds? Think about that for a second. Who's up in the clouds with these wonderful things that we want everyone to have? Well, you got the big, massive Fortune 500 companies. You got the U.S. government. You got world governments. You got Amazon, Microsoft, Apple. They're all up there. They can do something. They can influence those things. But where are the unions at? Where do the unions fit into this? Well, they're definitely not in the clouds. They're not flying at 31,000 feet. No, they're in the dirt. In fact, they're so deep in the dirt, they're praying it's not going to rain because if it rains, they're going to drown. Wouldn't it be great if instead of thinking that we were in the clouds, pretending that we had some influence up there, which we don't, we started making friends with everyone between us and the clouds? Think about how much better off we would be. How great would it be if we actually made friends with all these politicians? And regardless of our social beliefs and our social concepts and our social ideologies, we could unite behind this concept of labor first. And labor first being, if it gets me paid more, if it gets me home safe, if it gets me more time with my family, if it gets me quality health care and I get a good pension out of this so that I can die with dignity and financial independence and security. How awesome would that be? In fact, how awesome would it be if I could leave this world and leave some generational wealth to my family? Think about all the things I could do with the free time that I have because of the union. I could go fight for women's rights, or I could go fight for income equality, or I could go fight for all these things that's separate from my workplace. As in, unions should only be worried about workplace policy, because by them doing that one thing, they are providing workers the ability to go and fight the good fight. And that's where we are today. This is the problem. The problem is that we have lost touch with what the labor movement was about. We have lost touch with why those people died on the picket line. We have lost touch when we don't even understand what those workers on Blair Mountain were fighting for. Because they were fighting for fair wages, they were fighting for good working conditions, and they were fighting for pensions. That was it. They weren't fighting for anything else, because anything else was a distraction from what they needed to put food on the table. We're talking bread and butter kitchen table issues here. And what's happening right now in the labor economy, in the labor market, is anything but that. On the official front, on the non-official front, in general, we have lost perspective. And we are losing perspective every single day. We are going deeper and deeper in the rabbit hole, and the deeper we go, the more we lose. And I come right back to this concept that we are insane because we are doing the same thing over and over and over again and expecting different results. We're supporting the same politicians who are feeding us the same BS lines. And we're falling hook, line, and sinker for it. What have these politicians done for us? If they can get votes, they're going to say it. But they don't care, because if they cared, we wouldn't be hemorrhaging. We wouldn't be dying. There are ways to fix what's going on, but they just don't want to do it. So that's a bit of a tangent, but that's kind of morphing us into this labor thing that we have today. We have complete and utter misinformation, propaganda, and head in the sand syndrome within the labor movement. And we, for some reason, can't figure out that we are in big trouble, that we're not going to come out of this. This massive investment of labor is gone, unless we can figure out how to come into the 21st century of labor. And that means we got to go back to basics. That means we got to think about what labor is. Meat and potatoes, kitchen table, putting food on the table, putting money in the bank account, keeping the roof over our heads. That's what labor is. When you worry about those issues and those issues only, everyone unites behind us. Everyone. Union, non-union, politician, doesn't matter. They unite. When you don't, when you fight for issues that are in the clouds, way outside of our scope, way outside of our sphere of influence, what happens? Well, we lose. And the proof is in the pudding, because we have not been doing anything different and we're getting the living crap kicked out of us. I want to remind everyone listening that in 1969, unions made up 31% of the labor force. They influenced 75% of the U.S. marketplace, either through direct or indirect means, which means that union representation, only accounting for 31% of the labor market, influenced nearly 75% of the labor market. It was an employee-based marketplace. Employers were fighting for workers. Employees could name the terms. We went from that to today, where it is an employer-driven, employer-based marketplace, where employers dictate the terms of employment, where unions have no outside influence outside of the sphere of 10.3%, and we are basically dying of cancer, slow, and it's starting to speed up as we get closer to the deathbed. That's where we are. So, let's talk about why this is happening. This is happening because there was a little tiny cork put into the National Labor Relations Act by FDR himself. For lack of a better word, circuit breaker. It's a circuit breaker clause. It basically prevents unions from organizing nationally. And what does that mean? It means that unions cannot do what their counterparts in Europe have already done and form what we call sectoral unions or sector-based unions. So a sector-based union would be For example, maybe one or two labor unions represent all the workers in the transportation sector of a country, right? That's a sectoral union. That's the idea that everyone's a member, or at least everyone is represented by a union. And they pay agency fees to the union, comes out of their paycheck, and the union represents them. The union forms basic wage requirements, basic training requirements, basic requirements as far as healthcare and pension. It's kind of like a partnership between the unions and the employers, and it's kind of overseen in a weird kind of laissez-faire type manner by the government. All right, this is one of the reasons why you have countries in Europe that do not have a minimum wage, because they don't need one, because they have sectoral unions. Now, in these countries, right to work is a normal way of doing business. This idea that you don't have to join the union to be represented by the union, that's just the way it is. It's accepted. And that's what right to work is, by the way. Baseline, it's if you don't want to join a union, you don't have to join a union. But in these countries, you are required to pay for the contract. So you're required to pay for the services that you have been rendered by the union, unlike the United States. This is the difference between the two. And so in the United States, unions cannot become sectoral unions because you have to organize every single shop or factory or whatever, however you want to look at it. A shop is how the language defines it, but think of it like a factory. So if I'm Ford and I have two factories in Detroit, Factory 1 and Factory 2, the union can't organize Factory 1 and 2 together. They can try, but it's probably not going to happen. So let's say that we organize Factory 1. So the union comes in, they hold a vote, and now we're negotiating. And then they come into Factory 2, and they come in and they hold a vote, and now we're negotiating. So right now I'm negotiating two separate contracts for two separate factories. And this negotiation process can happen over the course of 2 years. And at the end of that, I could say as the employer, as Ford, you know what, I'm really not interested in doing that. Well, how hard is it to keep pace with an employer if the employer is opening 10 to 20 factories every single year? Because that's really where we were in the 60s and 70s. Manufacturing was growing exponentially. So how are you supposed to organize all these places, keep pace with the employer, if you're unable to do that because of the federal law that dictates the protocols required in order to become a union? Even for an established union, even for a national union, doesn't really make it easy, does it? Doesn't make it tangible to be able to keep up with the market. So what happens? Well, the unions start to act like injured dogs. You know, when you have a dog that's hurt and it's cornered, it becomes more dangerous than ever before. That's what unions are. We're willing to bite at anything because we're terrified, because we're dying, because our leadership is refusing to grow, is refusing to adapt and look at the new way of representation. And so this kind of leads me to question 2 here. I'm going to go ahead and warm up my pad. And the second question here is right to work good or bad? Well, if we look at it from a European standpoint, right to work's, it's a moot point. It doesn't matter. It's not good or bad. It's the way it works. It's the way it is. In principle, no, right to work is not bad. In fact, in principle, I want right to work to exist. I don't want you to join my union if you don't want to. I don't want you to be forced to join an organization you don't believe in. But I want you to pay for the contract that you're working under. That's the difference. I don't care if right to work exists. But the problem today is that in the United States, right to work doesn't require the employee to pay agency fees. And this is the problem. And this honestly filters all the way back to this idea of duty of fair representation. And so in the 1940s, you had railway unions. These were systemic racist organizations, as in a systematic racist organization that did not want anyone other than white workers involved. That's how it worked. And so these unions tried to negotiate a backhanded deal with the railroad companies to basically phase out all the black workers, because the black workers were not a member of the union. Not because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't, because the union wouldn't let them in. And so the federal government wasn't protecting them. The legislature wasn't protecting them. So where do they turn? Well, they went to the Supreme Court. And there were a bunch of cases that had to do with these black railroad workers suing the union suing the employer. And it turns out you can't do that. You can't protect one class of worker working under the same contract and not the other just because they're not a member of a union. This is where that whole concept of duty of fair representation comes from. This is really the backbone of right-to-work legislation. Right-to-work legislation won't allow unions to discriminate against workers. So if the state is a right-to-work state, then you can work for that employer and you don't have to pay anything to the union. But here's the catch. The union still has to protect you, still has to represent you, and still has to give you training if the employment contract requires them to do that. They still have to dispatch you on jobs if the employment contract requires them to do that. It also limits this whole idea of a security clause. So the one way unions could work around this whole concept of right to work is by saying, well, you have to join the union in order to work for the employer. Well, right to work prevents the security clause from taking place. So what this means is that all of the stuff that came out of these court cases concerning duty of fair representation is combined with the right to work legislation, which basically says you don't have to join a union as a condition of employment. And it's the perfect storm of destroying a union. So let's talk about how it destroys a union for a second. Unions under right to work start to suffer major losses in income. You have to remember that union dues or agency fees, depending on how the union is set up, pay the bills. They pay the electric bill, they pay the salaries of the officers who are employed by the union to represent the workers. They pay for the lawyers who negotiate the contract with the employers. So, as the financial capabilities of the institution starts to suffer, the services that are rendered to the members start to suffer. As that happens, more and more members leave the organization, but again are still represented by the organization. Solidarity continues to dwindle. By this point in time, typically employers are starting to push a message that the union is not doing anything for you, that it's a waste of money, that it's a waste of time, and more employees leave the institution. When this happens, the union typically has two options: continue to fight and become financially insolvent, or shut down and dissolve. The first option, which would be continuing to fight and face financial insolvency, comes with a serious penalty for the members who are still left. See, you are a member of the union, which means that you do share a financial liability for the institution. So if the union is put into the rears, if you will, if they run out of money, they are forced to assess the membership in order to become financially stable and solvent again before it can dissolve. The union cannot dissolve and owe anyone any money. So that's the first option. The second option is that the union voluntarily dissolves before it runs out of money, and then essentially gives the money either to the national chartered organization or the membership. Get a check and that's it. The dissolution is completed. These two options mean that the union can no longer represent the workers. Once this happens, it's checkmate. Once this happens, there is no one to enforce pensions. There is no one to enforce health care. There is no one to enforce wages. There is no one to enforce that the contract is being followed. So there is no protection for the workers. And there's usually like a little bit of a limbo situation here, because the workers, as a bargaining unit, negotiated the contract. So until that contract is either dissolved by the employer, dissolved legally by the courts, or it expires naturally, technically the employees are still working under a collectively bargained agreement with no representation. And this becomes incredibly problematic. And so this is how unions die. in a right-to-work situation. Specifically, how private sector labor unions die in a right-to-work situation. Unions work off the concept of shared labor. This means that you, me, and Joe Schmo come together and we pool our labor in a monetary form. That's our labor in a cash form. We put it together and we form a labor union. And that labor union is doing nothing more than getting us better contracts, than negotiating a better contract for us. In essence, it's an investment in better contracts, better health care, better working conditions, and better pension. Right? We've all come together. We're pooling our money in the form of dues, and we are asking lawyers to work for us as one group, as a bargaining unit, and we are negotiating better working conditions. That's what a union is. There's no difference between them and someone who's protecting their private property or their home, right? So I liken union representation to the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. It's the same thing to me. The right to form a union should be enshrined in the U.S. Constitution, just like the right to bear arms is. So let's break this down then. What is labor? Labor is the monetary form of property, right? So when we think of labor, most of us think of physical labor or manual labor. But when you look at labor from the standpoint of a value-added product, it's actually three independent assets that have been combined to make a value-added product. So the first asset is your time. 24 hours in a day. We all have that. There's no difference between the guy working at McDonald's or Jeff Bezos when it comes to the amount of time you have in a day. We have 24 hours in a day. There's the skill. All right, that's the investment of your time to learn a skill. Whether you've learned it in school or whether you're learning it on the job, that's irrelevant. You're learning a skill. And so labor is the investment of time, which is a commodity, which everyone has, into a skill, which is not something that everyone has. So that's a value-added product. Then you combine experience. This is the amount of time you have been utilizing the skills that you have learned. This is the labor equation. Time plus skill plus experience equals labor. Labor is a value-added product. It's a value-added product that you own. You own your labor. You choose when, where, and why you alienate it. This is the entire concept of private property. It's also one of the reasons why the founding fathers didn't tax us income tax. Because how can you tax something that someone owns? The idea that you are working for an employer means that your employer is providing you their labor in exchange for your labor. Their labor in its monetary form, your labor in its physical form. Those two make a transaction. It is a transference of private property, which means that unions are protecting Americans' private property. Another way to look at this is that right to work is nothing more than government-supported theft of labor. If you believe that labor is a value-added product, and I have never met a Republican who didn't, for that matter, I have never met a Democrat who didn't, then you cannot look at right-to-work legislation in its current form, where it doesn't allow for either security agreements to exist and or require agency fees by all parties working under the contract. You cannot look at that from the standpoint of private property rights and say that this is either ethical or moral. Because what this is government-supported, government-endorsed theft of labor. Plain and simple. 1 + 1 = 2 here. But we, the labor movement, we don't fight that fight. We talk about right to work from a moral perspective. Who cares about the moral perspective? Because the moral perspective is a losing perspective. Because we are losing. It's a property rights issue, plain and simple. It has to do with property rights. We need to start fighting it from the standpoint of property rights. The closest anyone ever got to preventing a right to work law from taking over was in West Virginia in 2016. It was argued that this was stolen labor. The argument almost stood. That's how we win the fight. We don't win it getting rid of right to work. We win it by fighting for agency fees, fighting for mandatory agency fees. We win it by talking about labor in a way that everyone can understand it. We win it by fighting for labor for working men and women in this country. We win it by actually talking about labor issues instead of social issues. We win it by fighting for kitchen table issues. The mortgage, the car payment, food on the table, making your life better. That is a Republican idea. That is a Democrat idea. From the leftist of the left to the rightist of the right, we can all unite behind the idea that collectively we can get more than less. We need to start fighting from that standpoint and start pushing that narrative. Because the narrative that we are continuing to push, the narrative that it is us versus them, that it is the left versus the right, that it is the worker versus the corporation, that doesn't work. We have proven it time and time again. It is time to adopt the 21st century labor movement. A worker-first agenda. Wages, healthcare, working conditions, and pensions. Plain and simple. I'm often asked by many on the left, if this is your perspective, how are you going to get universal healthcare? How are we going to make income inequality disappear? It's simple. The best regulation is unionization. The best way to get healthcare for every American is to have sectoral unions. The best way to promote a free market economy is to have strong labor unions. Strong labor unions pushing for the same thing. Companies making money, providing good quality benefits to their employees, and their employees being able to have a good quality of life. That is the future, not only of free market capitalism, but of our nation. We fix the problem by invoking the most productive system we've ever seen, which is employer-provided benefits based on employee-driven contracts. The best representation is unionization, and the best regulation is always unionization, plain and simple. That's how we win this fight. In the next episode, we're going to talk about a piece of legislation that we are currently working on to solve this problem. That is mandatory agency fees at the national level. This would fix the majority of the right to work issues we see nationally, and this would lead the way and bridge a gap and allow for sectoral unions to begin the process of privatizing and deregulating the labor force. The best of both worlds. That's the next episode of the Pro Labor Conservatives podcast. Thanks so much for listening.